What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to this week's installment on The Lake Show, and I really appreciate you all making me a part of your day again. So last week, I made my third and final NFL mock draft. I just did the entire first round. Just me personally, how I thought the NFL draft was going to turn out on day one, in round one. And all I can say is that a lot happened that I personally didn't expect, and there's a bunch of reactions out there to the one and only Shedeur Sanders and the reason why he fell so far in the draft. And I'll be honest, I didn't see this coming. I saw a possibility that he would fall in the first round, but that's exactly it. Fall in the first round. To the later picks, obviously Pittsburgh was in. There was discussions about Pittsburgh drafting him with the 21st overall pick and everything in between. So, you know, it's just an unfortunate luck of the draw for Shedeur Sanders, and we're going to start off the show with that today. But last week, that's what we talked about. I did my NFL mock draft. Now this week, we're going over my NFL draft recap on a few players and a few teams, and that's what we have in store today. And obviously, you all know I'm a Bucked Up ambassador, so use promo code SHOW32. Get yourself 20% off any and all pre-workout orders at buckedup.com. And I want to thank again my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, every single day for allowing me to do this and to just allow me to just live such a happy life. You know, far too often we allow ourselves to just be consumed with so much stress that's put on our shoulders by this world. But, you know, if there's one who truly understands that meaning of stress, it would be the one and true King, Jesus Christ. So I give all praise and all glory to the one true God of our universe. Now, where are we going to start off the show with today? And, well, you know, it's pretty obvious where we're going to start. We're going to start with quarterback Shedeur Sanders out of Colorado. Many predicted Shedeur Sanders was a top 2 quarterback in this past draft, along with Cam Ward from the University of Miami. Those were looked at as the 2 prospects that were surefire first-round picks. You know, no rhyme or reason, no debates about it. Those looked like the 2 most NFL-ready quarterbacks in this entire draft. And, well, Shedeur Sanders was not just passed up in the first round, not the second round, or the third round, or the fourth round. Shedeur Sanders fell all the way to the 5th round to the Cleveland Browns with the 144th overall pick in the NFL draft. So now everybody's up in arms about this. Everybody is questioning, why did Shedeur Sanders fall so hard? Why did he fall so far down in the draft when many people, myself included, believed him to be a top 3 to top 2 quarterback that was in this draft class? Now, it's not necessarily the strongest draft class for quarterbacks. Obviously, it's nothing compared to what we had last year with J.J. McCarthy, Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix. The list goes on and on, like, of just quality top-tier quarterback talent to come out in the 2024 NFL draft. But people are just up in arms, and it's actually the most hysterical thing on planet Earth. And I'm going to play a clip. Obviously, this is one of the most notorious people when it comes to NFL mock drafts. We got Mel Kiper, and senior NFL draft analyst from ESPN. Yeah, this clip is owned by ESPN. I own none of it. This is strictly for entertainment. But this is what Mel Kiper was saying about Shedeur Sanders not selected in the first 3 rounds. This doesn't even count the 4th round. But this is what Mel Kiper was, you know, up in arms about, you know, a couple nights ago.
I think it's disgusting. I don't understand what the heck's going on with this. 5th player on my board. It's never happened before in 47 years where a player that high has dropped this far into the 4th round. A quarterback that's sitting there in round 4 with other quarterbacks being taken who aren't as good as Shedeur, aren't even close, in my opinion, in terms of accuracy, toughness. Arm strength is certainly more than good enough. I don't see, outside of not being have the rocket arm and the 4.6 speed and the big frame, the 6'3", 230-pound frame, what is he lacking? Somebody's going to have to explain that one to me. 4th round, Kirk Cousins went. 4th round, Dak Prescott went. Worked out pretty good for them. It's just that Shedeur was projected a lot higher than they were. That's why we're having this discussion.
Okay, so yes, I guess that's why we are having this discussion. Mel Kiper. But here's the reality of why Shedeur Sanders fell. And this is my personal opinion, but I feel like everybody can, gather around that and agree with me saying that, humbleness is not necessarily a bad thing. Humbleness is one of the best qualities that you can probably have when you live your life, to its fullest. A little bit of humbleness about yourself goes a long way. Early on in this draft process, early on when, mock drafts were just being made, this is early January. We're still, at that point, months away from the NFL draft happening. Deion, a lot of this does fall on Shedeur, and a lot of this falls on Deion Sanders, his father. So when it comes to Deion Sanders, early on we saw a bunch of clips saying that they would hold out. They're not going to play for this team. Oh, I'm not going to let my son go to this team, or that team. And then later down the line, you get, we would be happy for him to play anywhere. That was probably because he was dropping down. And he also had, Shedeur, I'm talking about now, has a little bit of arrogance to him and rubbed a lot of teams the wrong way and a lot of coaches the wrong way. So when you look at this entire dynamic, is he the most talented quarterback in this draft? No. I would easily give that to Cam Ward, especially with what he did at the University of Miami last year. It's not for a lack of talent, but I believe it is a lack of maturity. I think he's still a franchise quarterback. I still believe he can be a franchise quarterback for the Cleveland Browns eventually. He may end up being a day one starter at this upcoming NFL season. So what are we really up in arms about? Just the fact that it's Deion's son and the fact that he dropped so far in this NFL draft when many people believed he was a first round, caliber quarterback. I was personally shocked that Pittsburgh did not take him in the first round. I was very shocked about that. And I was even more shocked that the Giants traded back into the first round and didn't even take Shedeur Sanders. They took Jackson Dart out of Ole Miss. But when you look at this grand scheme of things, it's not necessarily, if you have all the talent in the world, clearly that even shows like it doesn't really matter, especially after what happened in this past draft. But a little bit of humbleness would have went a long way for Shedeur Sanders. Thinking he's going to be one of the top draft picks. We went from thinking, who's going to go number one overall? We went from debating, is it going to be Cam Ward or is it going to be Shedeur Sanders? Then all the talk is it going to be Shedeur Sanders or Travis Hunter, who goes to the Cleveland Browns? And then the third overall pick to the New York Giants. We were debating if it was going to be Abdul Carter or was it going to be Shedeur Sanders. And then later down the line, you get Shedeur Sanders is falling in a lot of people's mock drafts and in the draft in general. Next, we were talking about the New Orleans Saints with the 9th overall pick because it's blatantly obvious that the Saints needed a quarterback, which they did address. I'll get to that in a minute. But then he fell past the Saints. And everybody thought at that point in time, okay, it looks like Shedeur Sanders going to Pittsburgh was going to be an actual reality. And I personally wouldn't have had a problem with it. I mean, Shedeur Sanders would not be my top option as a Pittsburgh Steelers quarterback, but considering everything that's going on with the Steelers, I would definitely have taken Shedeur Sanders. Part of me wishes Pittsburgh took Shedeur Sanders, but I understand why all 32 teams passed on Shedeur Sanders for 4 consecutive rounds because he rubbed people the wrong way in his interviews. I'm not just saying this. You can look up a bunch of articles that have said and a bunch of videos that people have said he rubbed people the wrong way. It was one of the worst interviews that coaches have been through with an upcoming, player that should be drafted. There's a sense of, arrogance when it comes to Shedeur Sanders. And all I'm saying is that, talent can't be everything. Quarterbacks are held to a different standard. We've seen people rip quarterbacks for their character on and off the field. We've seen people rip quarterbacks multiple different ways. And especially for quarterbacks, you are looked at as the head of the franchise. You are steering the entire team in one direction. You have to be the leader of men in that locker room, galvanizing the troops, getting ready to perform at your absolute best on your journey to capture a Lombardi Trophy. That's the ultimate goal of a quarterback. You have to lead that franchise both on and off the field with your character and just your entire demeanor as a person. So when you look at Shedeur Sanders and the cockiness and the arrogance, I've seen this before. It was called Baker Mayfield, but Baker Mayfield, he was a Heisman Trophy winner at Oklahoma, nearly got to the national championship. He was by far maybe at this point in his career, maybe not worthy of a number 1 overall pick, but definitely a solid quality franchise quarterback. He's really turned his career around with Tampa Bay, as we can see. I still think Tampa Bay has a quote-unquote Super Bowl window if they fix up their defense and, add a little bit more to their offense. I think Tampa Bay is absolutely a contender with Baker Mayfield at the helm, compared to a couple of years ago with Jameis Winston at the helm of the Buccaneers, where I didn't see any of that. But getting back to Shedeur Sanders, the reason he fell is not for his talent. It is because of his lack of maturity and his arrogance, his lack of humbleness coming into the draft. I think it rubbed a lot of coaches the wrong way. And because of NIL, quarterbacks and other players, but mainly quarterbacks, they're coming in with a couple $1 million in the bank already. They come in I would say, like hotshots almost. They quote unquote made their money in college, and now they're taking that next step. If you walk into interviews and just, act like you own the joint, act like you're already made, can we at least see Shedeur, take a snap in the NFL? Can we at least see him on, during a training camp or a mini camp in the NFL first before he starts going on? I'm not saying confidence isn't a bad thing, but when it comes off as a lack of humbleness and blatant arrogance to the current situation at hand, yeah, then you have a problem. So with guys like Mel Kiper saying this is absolutely, blasphemous that he dropped this far, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I believe Shedeur is like a B to B plus kind of prospect. The best prospect in this draft quarterback-wise, not according to Mel Kiper, but the majority of everybody else suggested Cam Ward. And people could put Cam Ward on the level of Bo Nix. Now, Bo Nix is a quality starter in the NFL, and he's got a bright future ahead. But when you look going forward, there was so much, the talent disparity between those guys and Bo Nix, like Caleb Williams, J.J. McCarthy, all those, and Jaden Daniels, those guys, those are looked at as generational talents. Then you got Bo Nix, who's up there, and Cam Ward's kind of on that level, and then it's Shedeur. The fact that Shedeur was talking about and Deion were talking about early on in this process, we're not going to allow you to play there or play there. Okay, Shedeur Sanders is not the next Peyton Manning. He is not the next John Elway. He is not the next Andrew Luck. He's not that kind of prospect. So the fact that so many people were hyping him up this way, I think it's a big-time brutal mistake. I thought Shedeur Sanders was a top 2 quarterback, top 3 quarterback in this draft class. I felt like he definitely could have been a first-round pick, especially over Jackson Dart. I don't mind Jackson Dart, but I personally have a preference. I like Jackson Dart a little bit better than Shedeur, but either way, those two are interchangeable for me. But when you look at this grand scheme of things, when you look at Shedeur Sanders, he just had his number retired at Colorado. He went 13-12 at Colorado. Didn't really win any national accolades other than quarterback of the year, I believe. He didn't win the Davey O'Brien. Somebody said he won the Davey O'Brien. That went to Cam Ward. But Shedeur Sanders was 1-8 against the top 25, I believe, and he was 13-12 in his career at Colorado. That doesn't happen unless you have, Deion's last name on the back of your jersey. Travis Hunter, I can kind of understand him getting his jersey retired because he honestly could be looked at as a generational talent. Nobody plays both sides of the football at such a high level other than Travis Hunter. That's something that I personally haven't seen in college football. I've seen it here and there with a couple players like Jabril Peppers every now and then, older players like Desmond Howard or Charles Woodson. You can look at that. But we got to stop acting like Shedeur Sanders was an Andrew Luck level prospect, because he wasn't. So, it is what it is. A little bit of humbleness would have went a long way for Shedeur Sanders. Here's some of the quarterbacks that were taking. Here's all the quarterbacks that were taken ahead of Shedeur Sanders. Cam Ward, really no arguments can be made there. Jackson Dart, maybe you have an argument, but maybe not. Tyler Shuck, you definitely have an argument. Jalen Milroe, you definitely have an argument. And Dylan Gabriel, definitely have an argument. I don't understand the Dylan Gabriel pick whatsoever. I thought Gabriel would have been one of the last quarterbacks to go off the board in this draft. But I think it was a maturity issue, and I think it was a humbleness issue. And I think that stemmed from his daddy, Deion Sanders. So, a little bit of humbleness can go a long, long way. Okay, now we're going to move on. We're going to discuss a couple teams now when it comes to their draft and how I personally think they did. So when it comes to my favorite team, the Pittsburgh Steelers, we're going to chat about them a little bit. I have my issues with Pittsburgh, but the fact that they did not take a quarterback in the first round tells me that indeed Aaron Rodgers will more than likely be signing in Pittsburgh. When you look at Pittsburgh, now, again, I'm recording this on Sunday night. This is up Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. But when you look at the Pittsburgh Steelers, they did end up drafting a quarterback. They drafted Will Howard out of Ohio State, national champion winning quarterback, big kid, athletic, accuracy is spotty. He was one quarterback I thought Pittsburgh would go after in the later rounds, and they in fact did. I was actually pleasantly surprised that quarterback was actually on Pittsburgh's radar to draft, just because of, basic history tells us that Pittsburgh doesn't do that. Mason Rudolph back in 2017, I believe it was, that didn't pan out. Kenny Pickett really didn't pan out. Maybe Will Howard. I think Will Howard has a chance to be a starter in Pittsburgh eventually later down the line. If he works on his accuracy skills, I definitely think Pittsburgh will, I think Will Howard could be a solid quarterback. If he works a little bit more on his fundamentals and footwork and accuracy, I think he can be a solid starter. But the fact that Pittsburgh skipped on Shedeur Sanders, that tells me that Aaron Rodgers is more than likely going to sign, if he hasn't already by the time this video is up. But the rest of Pittsburgh's draft, Derek Harmon, D-tackle out of Oregon with their first-round pick, running back Caleb Johnson out of Iowa in the third round with the 19th overall pick in the third round, Jack Sawyer, defensive end from Ohio State, Yahai Black from Iowa, defensive tackle. I'm sorry if I butchered the name. Will Howard in the sixth round. Carson Bruner from Washington, linebacker. And then Dante Kent from Central Michigan, another cornerback. So Pittsburgh really addressed all their issues that they needed in this draft, especially except offensive tackle. I would have liked to see them draft maybe one more tackle rather than another cornerback. I think Pittsburgh's defensive backfield is actually pretty good. And again, Cameron Hayward isn't going to be there forever. So the Derek Harmon pick in round one makes more sense to me now since they drafted Will Howard in the sixth round. If Pittsburgh didn't draft a quarterback whatsoever, that means they were putting all their chips in on the Mason Rudolph basket or in the Aaron Rodgers basket. And let me tell you, I would have been completely off of that. And now a lot of people are going to say, what if Aaron Rodgers doesn't come? Do you think Will Howard will be ready? I personally don't know if Will Howard will be ready, but I do know what happens when you give Will Howard a decent offensive line and immaculate skill position players. We saw what he did with Emeka Egbuka and Jeremiah Smith at Ohio State as his receivers, and Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins at running back, and a top offensive line in college football. Now, Pittsburgh doesn't necessarily have the top offensive line in the NFL, but they have George Pickens, DK Metcalf, Roman Wilson, still a plenty of depth. They got Pat Freiermuth, Jalen Warren, and now I think Caleb Johnson out of Iowa will be, I think that's a sneaky, fantastic pick for Pittsburgh. If there's one thing Pittsburgh always loves to do, it's run the football, and Caleb Johnson personifies that, from Iowa in the Big Ten. If there's one thing the Big Ten is always known for, it is running the football. They have tons of great backs that have come out of the Big Ten. Caleb Johnson, the latest one, but also Travion Henderson this past draft. You had Quinshon Judkins this past draft. Other notable names include Saquon Barkley. So there's a lot of good quality talent to come out of the Big Ten. And I personally thought Pittsburgh, I'd give them like a B-plus draft out of this, maybe leaning on an A-minus. Jack Sawyer, a lot of people thought he could have been a first-round talent. I didn't necessarily see it. He wasn't necessarily a game changer for Ohio State, but he was a solid leader for the Buckeyes on that defense, and he did help them beat Texas in the final moments of that game to advance them to the national title. I personally like the Jack Sawyer pick to help out on the defensive line. Pittsburgh really addressed their front seven when it comes to defense. Linebacker Carson Bruner, underrated player in my opinion from Washington. He's got some serious skill. Obviously, son of a former Steeler tight end, which is awesome. Another legacy pick for Pittsburgh. But looking overall at Pittsburgh, I think that the reason they didn't take Shedeur Sanders, back to Shedeur Sanders a little bit. Mike Tomlin's one of the most player-friendly coaches in the NFL, probably the most player-friendly coach in the NFL. Pittsburgh has shown a willingness to deal with head cases when they drafted him. I mean, George Pickens is still on roster. You had Antonio Brown before, Le'Veon Bell before. Just guys that were absolute head cases for the organization. But Tomlin, kind of ignored it and was always a player's coach. It's bad when Mike Tomlin doesn't want to draft you because of, whatever outside issues you got going on or whatever arrogance that you have, on your shoulders. And, I think you can thank Deion and Shedeur for his drop. But overall, looking at the Pittsburgh Steelers, I think they're primed and ready to at least take another step forward in the right direction. Do I think they're going to make the playoffs this year? More than likely, because they always do somehow. No matter how many teams, no matter how many people pick Pittsburgh to finish last in the AFC North or finish third in the AFC North, guess what? If there's one thing that everybody has taught me is you don't doubt Mike Tomlin ever when it comes to, having a losing season. Again, that's not my standard. As a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, we should always be Super Bowl standards in the Steel City. But going forward, I think it's a step in the right direction, and I don't think Pittsburgh's taking a step back. I really don't. Even if Aaron Rodgers comes in, I think that's an upgrade from Russell Wilson personally. I think you can interchange him, but he's definitely an upgrade over Mason Rudolph, and I think he would be an upgrade over Will Howard because Will Howard's never taken a snap in the NFL before. But going forward, I think Pittsburgh's in a decent spot. I think Pittsburgh's in a really decent spot. All right, the next team I want to talk about, and I always relish the time I can talk about the Dallas Cowboys, and that's exactly who we're going to talk about. So the Dallas Cowboys, they addressed some needs. Their needs in this draft were wide receiver, running back, edge rusher, cornerback, and offensive guard. They addressed them all, except wide receiver. Go figure. Dallas Cowboys did not draft a receiver in this year's draft. I personally don't understand it. I really don't get it. I would have been more willing, if I was Dallas, to try and draft one of the higher end running backs in the earlier rounds. But in their their first round pick, Tyler Booker, offensive guard from Alabama. I personally like that pick. In round 2, they took Donovan Ezaraku from Boston College, edge rusher. I personally think that's the steal of the draft, and I think Ezaraku on the opposite side of Micah Parsons, that's going to be a deadly duo for pass rushers in the NFL. I think it could rank towards the top of pass rushing duos in the NFL this upcoming year, and I think personally Donovan Ezaraku has a chance to be better than Micah Parsons. Donovan's pure pass rushing talent, again, was one of the sack leaders in college football this past year, along with Mike Green from Marshall. I believe he had 16 and a half sacks this past year. But either way, yeah, he had 16 and a half sacks this past year. Ranked second in the FBS, only behind Mike Green from Marshall. Other notable draft picks from Dallas: Siobhan Revel from East Carolina in the 3rd round, cornerback. Running back, Jaden Blue from Texas in the 5th round. Linebacker, Shamar James from Florida in the 5th round. Johnny Cornelius from Oregon, offensive tackle. And then we get to Jay Toyal from UCLA, defensive tackle. I'm sorry if I butchered that. And then we got running back Phil Maffa from Clemson in the 7th round. Dallas needs more receiver help. They have needed more receiving help for the past, give or take, 2-3 years almost, because you cannot continuously rely only on CeeDee Lamb and a terrible, terrible run game. Now, part of that is because their offensive line isn't as great as it was when Zeke was in his prime. But again, they had a chance to make Derrick Henry a Dallas Cowboy. No, they let him go to the Ravens and have one of his best seasons ever as an NFL player. I just find it funny that Dallas chooses this draft of all drafts to address running back, and yet they do not go for one of the top-end running backs like an Ashton Genty or an Amari Hampton. No. They wait till the 3rd round. Jaden Blue, he's got some upside. He's got some burst to him. I personally like the 7th round pick, Phil Maffa from Clemson. I watched plenty of ACC football, me being a Hurricanes fan. Phil Maffa, he's just a bell cow bruiser kind of back. Not necessarily the fastest, but I definitely think Phil Maffa has a chance to at least, work his way into a starting role with the Dallas Cowboys. But just looking at and thinking of the Dallas Cowboys, they're an accident waiting to happen. Yes, I'm going to quote Stephen A. Smith again about the Dallas Cowboys. They're just an accident waiting to happen, and I don't believe the Dallas Cowboys have done anything necessarily that'll propel them past Washington and especially Philadelphia. The fact that Jahad Campbell, linebacker from Alabama, fell to Philadelphia with the 32nd pick in the draft, shame on a bunch of teams. Literally, shame on a bunch of teams for allowing the defending Super Bowl champions to literally just get better. I think Philly had a great draft. And I think Philly's primed and ready to make another Super Bowl run, and I think they will. Odds are, I believe they'll get to the NFC title game again. I think the Dallas Cowboys, listen, the Giants are a tire fire. The Giants need to win now, or otherwise Brian Dable's probably out of a job. And, Brian Schottenheimer, first-time head coach in the NFL, I don't know how well he's going to do. I really don't. And the fact that Dallas has still not addressed wide receiver, that's very puzzling to me. Of all drafts that you don't take a receiver, you don't take one in a very, very deep wide receiver draft. That makes no sense to me. I personally like their first two picks, but everything else after that's a bunch of meh. Other than Phil Maffa, who I actually personally think is a good back. But this is the typical Dallas Cowboys. They are just an accident waiting to happen. And if you want my personal opinion, they're probably going to finish last in the NFC East. And again, just because the Giants are such a tire fire, I think Dallas is a distant 3rd in the NFC East, and I don't think they make the playoffs yet again. All right, now we're going to talk about one more team. We're going to talk about the Tennessee Titans. So, as we know, the Tennessee Titans took Cam Ward first overall in the draft, quarterback from Miami. A lot of people ask, can this guy succeed in Tennessee? I think personally that Cam Ward can definitely succeed in Tennessee and possibly make the playoffs in his rookie year. When you look at this draft, it was all geared toward they had quarterback need, wide receiver, edge rusher, guard, and safety, like desperate needs. I think they solved their quarterback issue simply because between Will Levis and Mason Rudolph, combining for 22 touchdowns and 21 interceptions, there is not much worse you can do than that quarterback situation in the NFL. Excuse me. But this is an instant upgrade for Tennessee. And this is a very winnable division in Tennessee. You got the Houston Texans, who took kind of a step back, and C.J. Stroud kind of had a sophomore slump. You have the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are an utter mess and a tire fire, and have been. It all depends on Trevor Lawrence's health. But even when he does play, he's not necessarily the generational talent quarterback that we thought was the second coming of Andrew Luck or John Elway. And then you got the Indianapolis Colts, who have absolutely no quarterback situation with Anthony Richardson. They drafted Riley Leonard. Maybe it'll be a QB battle, but that told me, Indianapolis drafting a quarterback told me everything I needed to know about Anthony Richardson. They do not trust him. But if you look at the rest of Cam Ward with the Tennessee Titans, so other notable offensive players that they got Gunnar Helm, tight end from Texas, who actually set the Texas record for receiving yards and I think receptions by a tight end in Texas history. They also got Khalil Mullings with their last pick in the draft in the 6th round, running back from Michigan, who was actually a pretty dang good running back in college. You also got guys like, I'm going to butcher this guy's last name, Alec Ayomanor from Stanford. And if anybody watched Stanford and Colorado, this wide receiver from Stanford absolutely cooked Travis Hunter. Went off for like 13 receptions, 240-some yards, and 2 touchdowns against the Buffaloes, and specifically against Travis Hunter, because that's who was guarding him most of that game on defense. You know, and you have Tony Pollard already on roster. You have Calvin Ridley already on the roster. And you signed Tyler Lockett, you know, veteran wide receiver from Seattle, who probably still has some spark left in him. You revamped the offensive line a little bit. You're addressing the defense. I think Cam Ward, and they also brought in Xavier Restrepo, Cam Ward's number 1 wide receiver from Miami, as an undrafted free agent, reuniting those two. And as an undrafted free agent, I know odds are you probably won't make a team. I'm willing to bet everything I own that Xavier Restrepo makes the Tennessee Titans team, just because of how good a chemistry that he has with Cam Ward. I mean, those two were fantastic at Miami last year. And looking forward, what should a realistic outlook for Cam Ward be? I wouldn't say Super Bowl quite yet, but I definitely think they can make a push for the playoffs, because that division is just wonky. You know, Houston with, you know, they reeled a little bit, but I think they'll be better. You know, they'll battle with Houston. Jacksonville's a tire fire. Even with Trevor Lawrence healthy, they're still a tire fire. They have so many other issues that are going on. They do have a fantastic defensive line, you know, in front 7. But again, I don't think Travis Hunter moves the needle to Super Bowl contender or playoff contender necessarily. He'll play both sides of the football. I don't know how well that's going to go. And then you got the Indianapolis Colts, who are an absolute train wreck at quarterback position. So if we're being honest, I think Cam Ward has a legit shot to succeed, and succeed early in Tennessee. And that's going to wrap it up this week on the Lake Show, everyone. Again, I really appreciate you all making me a part of your day. If you're not already, please like and subscribe to the channel. You're really helping it out, and you're really helping it grow. And that's going to wrap it up this week on the Lake Show, everyone. Again, God bless to you all, and I really appreciate you all making me a part of your day. I'm your host, Dominic Lako. God bless.
I love the chase and the hunt, and I set the pace when I'm running. I always take what I want, and I always give it 100. Don't need a bank, no, I'm funded. Play the game like it's nothing. I'm always thankful for something. Don't take for granted, stay humble. Now wake up! It's time to look at the enemy. Look in the mirror if he is no friend to me. It's not